Cold case arrests. 20-year-old Robin Brooks was found murdered in her Rancho Cordova area apartment 40 years ago. The Sacramento County Sheriff's Office in 1980 said that she had left work just after midnight on April 24th. She was then expected to meet up with friends for a swim, but Robin never arrived. After not being able to get a hold of their friend, her friends forced their way into her apartment, and tragically, they found she had been murdered in her own bedroom. Robin had been sexually assaulted and stabbed repeatedly. Investigators were able to lift the killer's DNA off of her body, but had no way to match it to a killer at that time. However, that all changed in 2020 with the help of modern forensic science. In a news conference, the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office announced the arrest of Philip Wilson in connection with the sexual assault and murder of Robin Brooks. Using the same forensic DNA method called genetic genealogy that helped catch the Golden State Killer, authorities were able to match Philip's DNA to the DNA found at the crime scene. This prompted his arrest at his North Sacramento home. Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert said, "This new tool, as I've said before, is the perfect marriage between science and dedicated police work. With these two working together, science and really extraordinary police work, in this case, Philip Wilson now stands charged in a felony complaint in Sacramento County for the sexual assault and murder of Robin Brooks." She finished by saying, "I'm so glad this POS is alive and will face justice." Nancy Daughtry was 38 years old in 1986 when she was sexually assaulted and strangled in her Chisholm, Minnesota house. On July 16th, just after midnight, her boyfriend dropped her off at her house. She was working as an aide in a nursing home and was supposed to be moving the next morning to the Twin Cities to start training as an EMT. Her boyfriend wasn't able to get in touch with Nancy and eventually called the police. When officers arrived at her house, they found Nancy naked in bed with a pillow covering her face. There were obvious signs of a struggle, and that allowed police to collect her killer's DNA from under her fingernails. However, without advances in forensic science, her killer was never apprehended. That is until the beginning of 2020, when the Chisholm police worked with the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension by submitting the DNA evidence to the Parabon Nanolabs. Parabon is a company that analyzes public genealogy databases for clues about a suspect's lineage. They were able to identify Michael Carbo Jr., who was never a previous suspect. Officers were able to obtain samples of his DNA by collecting a bag of garbage they watched him throw into a dumpster. It matched the evidence investigators had collected from Nancy's house more than 3 decades before. According to the news articles, Nancy's case was complicated because she had hosted a party to celebrate her daughter's high school graduation shortly before her death. This meant a lot of extra fingerprints and DNA around the house, but thanks to modern science, her killer will now face justice. Jessica Baggin disappeared in the early hours of May 4th, 1996. She had just turned 17 years old and was visiting her sister and friends when she decided to walk home. Her house was about a mile away from her sister's, but the next morning her parents found that she had never made it back. Jessica's father reported her missing to the Sitka Police Department because by the end of the day, she still hadn't returned home and no one had made any contact with her. Investigators quickly mobilized a search and rescue team. They focused their efforts in a wooded area Jessica would have been walking very close to, and quickly the team located a shirt that would later be identified as the shirt she was wearing when she disappeared. Tragically, Jessica's body was then found about 2 hours later, discarded and hastily buried beneath the trunk of a fallen tree. Most of her clothing and personal items were also found in the surrounding area. 9 days after her body was discovered, a man confessed to the sexual assault and murder of Jessica Baggin. Although there was plenty of circumstantial evidence, it was determined that none of the physical evidence collected from the crime scene connected this man to the murder. The suspect went on trial for the murder anyways, and in 1997 was found not guilty on all charges. This meant the hunt for Jessica's killer would have to continue. The case would remain unsolved for years despite the tireless investigations by Sitka police, Alaska state troopers, and even a private investigation by her family. In fact, more than 100 potential suspects were cleared through DNA comparison, leaving the trail cold. Then in 2007, the original Sitka police officer that had investigated her death walked into the captain's office of the Alaska State Troopers Cold Case Investigation Unit and said, "We have to solve this case." For more than 11 years, they poured through the case looking for new angles. Then in 2018, it was discussed to try using the new forensic DNA procedure called genetic genealogy. The DNA was sent for research, and after months of searching, a new suspect had emerged, a man named Steve Branch. Investigators were able to establish that Steve had lived in Sitka at the time of Jessica's murder. They also learned that in March of 1996, Sitka police had investigated him for sexually assaulting a teenage girl. He was indicted and arrested for this in June of '96, but was later acquitted after a trial the following year. He then moved to Arkansas in 2010, and it would be nearly 10 years later that Alaskan authorities would reach out to Arkansas State Police and request assistance in the case. For weeks, the Arkansas State Police tried to obtain a DNA sample from Steve, but were unsuccessful. Then in the spring of 2020, Sitka police were able to obtain a discarded DNA sample from a relative of Steve that still lived in Alaska. This DNA analysis determined that Steve Branch was most likely the source of the DNA found on Jessica's clothing and body. In August of 2020, investigators from the Alaska Bureau of Investigation traveled to Steve's residence in Arkansas. They made initial contact with him and began to question him and ask for a DNA sample. He denied any involvement, but also refused to voluntarily provide a DNA sample. Investigators were forced to leave the residence and apply for a search warrant, as well as interview other witnesses who also lived in Arkansas. Their plan was to take Steve into custody after a positive DNA match. However, in a shocking turn of events, approximately 30 minutes after the investigators left Steve's house, he shot himself. Investigators were able to secure the search warrant and obtain the DNA sample they needed to confirm he was indeed Jessica's killer from his autopsy. 19-year-old Tammy Tracy was last seen alive on May 27, 1987, when she had drove her car to get it washed. She disappeared that day, and Georgia police would spend nearly a year looking for the missing girl. Her remains were eventually discovered by a bird watcher in the Sugar River Forest Preserve. Dental records were used to positively ID her body, and an autopsy discovered that she had been stabbed and fatally shot. The case frustrated police for decades, and with every lead, it only seemed to grow more cold. That all changed in 2020 when the Rockford police chief said that they believed they had finally ID'd the killer who had taken Tammy's life. Her family had never given up hope that an arrest would be made. They even put up billboards near the anniversary of her death to keep her memory and hopes of an arrest alive. Through the tenacity of the Rockford Police and the Winnebago County Sheriff's Office, 66-year-old Jesse Smith was eventually charged with the crime. He remains in custody, awaiting extradition back for his trial. In the city of Perth, in Western Australia, 18-year-old Sarah Spears disappeared after leaving a nightclub in January of 1996. She called a taxi around 2 a.m. and was seen by several witnesses waiting on the car to arrive. However, just a few minutes later, when the taxi driver arrived, she was gone. To this day, no trace of Sarah has ever been found. Then a few months later, 23-year-old Jane Rimmer disappeared after she stayed behind at a club when her friends wanted to leave. She was seen on security footage leaving the club, but tragically her remains were found nearly 2 months later, 40 kilometers south of her last known location. Then 27-year-old Sierra Glennon also disappeared while on her way home from the same hotel Jane Rimmer was seen at. Sierra was spotted walking south on a nearby highway and interacting with a light-colored car. 19 days later, her body was discovered close to where Jane's body had been found, just 40 kilometers south in Bushland. It took Australian authorities nearly 20 years to narrow down their suspects, and in 2016, arrested Bradley Edwards for the murders of Jane and Sierra. During his trial, he was also charged with the murder of Spears and a few other counts of breaking and entering, unlawful detention, and aggravated sexual assault. At the time of the murders, he was working as a Telstra telecom technician, and his work van became a main piece of evidence presented at his trial. Another important piece of evidence was his DNA under Sierra's fingernails. Although the defense argued that the DNA was contaminated, fibers found on the two girls' bodies were matched to another Telstra car that was seen by Sierra when she disappeared. He was found guilty of the murders of Jane and Sierra, but found not guilty in the disappearance of Sarah. It was noted that he was most likely the killer, but without her body, there was no forensic evidence tying Bradley to her disappearance. In December of 2020, he was sentenced to life in prison. Murder has no statute of limitations, and investigators are going to keep working on these cases for as long as needed to bring these killers to justice.